There's been a lot of fear coming out of Israeli media. The Iranian military, they have tested one of their most powerful ballistic missiles. This comes after, given these snapback conversations on sanctions, given renewed talks about aggression on Iran, that Iran will respond in a deadly manner. And Iranian International conducted this interview with Israel's ambassador to the UN, if that is a oxymoron, Danny Danon. And I think we might find his comments quite interesting about what is actually happening when it comes to Israel's capabilities.
Could some people say Iran could become similar to Lebanon, where Israel can come in and do military strikes when they see fit? How would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think that is the case. I think the infrastructure that they built in the past was very complicated. So it's not going to happen very fast.
And here you had a general admission that Israel is not considering strikes again, and in large part because it can't become another Lebanon. It can't become another site where Israel just has kind of carte blanche abilities to hit whenever they want.
Well, that media outfit is actually funded by the Israeli regime. And during the 12-day war, they were based in Tel Aviv and Al-Quds and sobbing for the colonizers, and they are deeply despised among ordinary Iranians. People are no longer afraid. The Iranians, when the Israelis carried out this blitzkrieg attack and slaughtered ordinary people, I think I said on your show during that time that quite near to where I live, they just destroyed an apartment block, killing everyone inside so that they could kill one person. I think 20-some kids were killed in that building. And then Western media calls it an intelligence coup. There's no intelligence coup. I mean, no senior Iranian official or scientist or general hides in Tehran. They live in their homes like everyone else. People in their neighborhood know where they live. It's no secret. And for them just to knock down an apartment built block, which is, of course, what they do all the time, the Israelis. They've been doing that in Lebanon during the war. I was in Lebanon last year when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred. They just massacred, people, and Western media would frame it as Hezbollah strongholds or Hezbollah targets in order to hide the fact that they were basically targeting ordinary people. They just wanted to destroy Beirut and Baalbek and other cities and slaughter women and children, just like they did, as I said, where they killed all the kids in this family and the father who were Americans. That's just what they do. But the Iranians are not afraid. As soon as the war started, after the Blitzkrieg and after the murder of all these senior military officials, the Iranians struck back, and they struck back hard, and they did it day after day, and they basically controlled the skies over Palestine. The Israelis could do nothing about Iranian missiles. And during the last few days, if we go back and recall what Steve Bannon said, and Steve Bannon is someone who knows what's going on in the United States, he said the real story is that Trump saved Netanyahu. During the last 3 days of the war, 4 days of the war, Netanyahu was begging for a ceasefire. And Trump was sending messages to Iran to please stop. And ultimately, he had to give concessions until Iran finally accepted a halt in the strike. So no one is afraid of the Israeli regime anymore. We saw Iranians go to the streets under missile fire across the country in support of the armed forces. They thought that by killing all these people, they could create chaos in the country. But they did the opposite. They brought people under one command and steadfast. They made them steadfast and determined to defeat this genocidal enemy, this enemy that considers everyone subhuman except for themselves, this enemy which has the full support of the West. When they carried out the war against Iran, the Europeans said Israel has the right to defend itself. So they launch a war, and they have a right to. When they're killing slaughtering Gazan families, they have a right to defend themselves. When they slaughter people in Lebanon, they have a right to defend themselves. When they slaughter ordinary people in Yemen, the 31 journalists, they targeted those journalists. Did you see any outrage in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or the Independent or those who pretend to be alternative or different from. No, they're because they're all the same and they're all controlled. It's either controlled opposition or they towed the government line. So, but all of these are carried out to defend themselves. And I think that the 12-day war between Iran and Israel was a defining factor in this war. The biggest change, I mean, the number one defeat for the Israeli regime in these 2 years is its delegitimization in the eyes of the world. The Israeli regime was never legitimate, neither within the 1967 borders or beyond the 1967 borders. In fact, Desmond Tutu, who your younger viewers may not know, but he was an important force in South Africa during apartheid. He went to Palestine and visited after the fall of apartheid South Africa. And he said that the situation in Palestine is far, far worse than what he saw in South Africa during apartheid. And this is before October the 7th. We're not talking about Desmond Tutu's passed away years ago. So the biggest change is that in the eyes of the world that have been that for the most part were ignorant about what was going on, or they were being misled by Western media, Western think tanks, Western elites, Western diplomats and journalists and politicians. They now see the regime for what it is. It is carrying out a Holocaust. It is as illegitimate as Hitler. In fact, this is in many ways more evil because they're doing it in front of the eyes of the world. They're doing it in front of cameras every day. We never saw what Hitler did. We never saw what the tyrants of human history did. We read about them in history books, maybe a picture or two from Algeria, maybe a grainy picture from Kenya or something from India. We hear about these things or we read about these things, but here we're seeing the most horrific images literally every single day. And even though Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and others are doing their best to make them all disappear, and of course TikTok will do a really good job quite soon to make everything disappear. But the regime has become delegitimized. However, the 12-day war was a defining moment because for once someone hit back really hard, and the Israeli regime was losing the war, and they had to beg for a ceasefire. They were defeated by Hezbollah in 2006, but this is something very different. They were hit very hard. And the regime today, if it was to attack Iran again, it would be much worse because the regime gave it its best shot. They used everything they had. This was a regime change operation, as they call it. They use all the latest technology. I mean, the Ukrainian regime could only dream of the weapons. Zelensky can only dream of the weapons that Israel has. The Israeli regime has. But the Iranians were caught off guard. The Iranians, I mean, there is something I should point out. The Iranians knew that an attack was going to happen. They knew that an attack was going to happen that night, in fact. But they didn't know that the regime was going to target the state. They thought they were going to bomb the nuclear program or they were going to bomb military bases, but they didn't think that they were going to go rogue. And that was a mistake. The Iranians miscalculated. It was a failure. But despite that, they turned things around and the tide turned and they defeated the regime. So the regime is now illegitimate. It is vulnerable. And what Yemen is doing, it is reminding us of the vulnerability of the regime. But again, I have to stress what Ansarullah has said repeatedly, the armed forces of Yemen, the government of Yemen has said repeatedly, stop the Holocaust and we will stop the siege. End the massacre of children and we will stop blocking ships from crossing through the Red Sea. It's quite simple. What Ansarullah is doing, what the Yemeni armed forces are doing, what the Yemeni government and people are doing is that they're implementing the Genocide Convention, something that the West not only refrains from doing, it refuses to do. It is doing the exact opposite.
In that video of the Tel Aviv-funded outlet, Iranian International, it's almost like they were trying to goad the ambassador into cheering on another iteration, a round two against Iran. But your reaction to the response, which was, no, I don't know. The Iranian, they say infrastructure is civilian, infrastructure is troublesome. What is the impact of Iran's ability to stand up, to fight back, to not be afraid, as Professor Marandi said, and to do things like, as conversations are happening with the E3 around snapback sanctions and their demands for Iran to get rid of its not only nuclear program, but also its ballistic missile program, that Iran is testing their missiles because they're getting ready to defend themselves again. What kind of message is this sending?
Absolutely. I think this has a lot to do with the degree of arrogance within the Israeli establishment. You are always fighting against enemies who are much weaker than you are. And with time, Israel kind of reached this calculation that it's invincible, that no one is strong enough to fight Israel. I mean, the Israeli arms industry is at one point, I think it was number 7 or 8 in terms of global exports. Israel has been seen as kind of a heavy lifter in the arms market, and Iran has been a country under an American siege, a Western American siege, for such a long time. So they must have reached some major miscalculations there, not only regarding Iran's capabilities, but also regarding the nature of the Iranian response, thinking that, well, we have this insurance, and the insurance is Washington. No matter what happens, Washington will always come to the rescue. Washington will never allow us to sink financially, economically. Washington will provide. Even when Ansarullah placed a siege on Eilat and the Red Sea, effectively shutting down the port, which one of the main sources of food to Israel, the Arabs came to the rescue. And by the way, they are still coming to the rescue, providing this kind of alternative, US-sponsored alternative route to get the Israelis fed and to make sure that their kids have toys and their pharmacies have medicine and all the rest, while their own brethren in Gaza are, being raped and die from hunger and pulverized by Israeli bombs. So Israel is always, rest assured, that Washington will always make sure that no matter how bad things get for Israel, it will be okay. That was the understanding. And we have to also place that within a context. And the context is that Iran has been the top target for Israel for such a long time. I mean, we go back to the Iraq War, where the neoconservatives made it clear to the American public that the threat was not only Iraq and the Iraqi military as far as Israel is concerned, but also Iran. And even before the American-Western war on Iraq, Netanyahu was speaking in Congress, was speaking in various US platforms, telling them Iran is even a bigger threat than Iraq. So he kind of been building this massive political discourse around the idea that Iran needs to be eliminated for Israel to finally feel a sense of safety. This goes for, this has been going on for a long time. And we all remember Richard Pearl with his famous, securing the realms document done on behalf of the Netanyahu, or for the sake of the Netanyahu government, kind of trying to rearrange the Middle East in Israel's favor, rolling back Damascus, regime change in Iraq, eliminating Iran and that sort of thing. And then that opportunity came. The opportunity came with the rise of the Trump administration, one of the most foolish administrations in the history of that country. Yes, they are all, to various degrees, have been quite criminal, but there is a difference between being criminal, but also criminal and foolish as well. This administration, I don't even know if we are to, as future historians, when they try to understand the doctrine, what is the Trump administration's doctrine in the Middle East or globally? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. It's a huge mess. His speech at the United Nations is one of the most embarrassing political spectacles, not only in the history of the US, but in the history of the UN as well, where he took advantage of this criminal, a fundamentalist, foolish administration to finally carry out the major attack on Iran. And as Professor Marandi has said, indeed, they have gone all the way. I mean, they activated not only their entire air defense or their entire air force, but also an air defenses, but also intelligence. They went for the civilian infrastructure. They were trying to get to take advantage of the political schism in Iranian society, which is natural and normal in any society. They tried to take advantage of all of these things and to finally take down the Iranian government. And they miserably failed. You know, there's that saying that says, if you hit the king, you better kill the king, or something of that nature. And they actually went for it. They were trying to kill the king and they couldn't. And as a result, Iran has been restoring all of its defenses, its radars in particular. They have been building this kind of like filling all the loopholes regarding intelligence and so forth. What can Israel do in the next strike that they haven't done in the previous one? What are the surprise cards that Israel will have in the next confrontation with Iran? They have already pretty much showed all of their cards. It would be shocking to see any new elements to the Israeli attack on Iran that have not been used so far. And that creates a huge problem here because, again, Netanyahu has been basing his entire career since he became prime minister, I think the first time in 1996, until today, on this crown jewel, the taking down of the Iranian government. And he had that chance and he miserably failed. And nothing has changed as far as the military equation in the Middle East, neither in Gaza, nor in Yemen, nor elsewhere. So what can they do that they haven't already done? Now, we already know, and I'm going to finish with that, that Israel has already been on the path of what they call suicide nationalism. You know, where, heck with the consequences, let's just do what we can and let's just see. Let's see what the outcome is going to be. So Israel could, in fact, go and start a new war against Iran. And the Iranians must be very much aware of that, considering the fact that Israel just hit one of the closest allies of Washington outside of NATO, and that is Doha. So wouldn't they try to hit Iran again? Yes, they would, they could, they might, they will. But what can they achieve from that? I think very little, if any at all. And I think the counterattack from Iran most likely is going to be even more decisive than the last one.
United States side, as Ramzy was saying, has a very confused policy right now in West Asia, but the default is, of course, total support of Israel. And that total support of Israel by the Trump administration is getting quite petty and almost pathetic. During UN week, we had stories like this: Iranian diplomats in the U.S. being barred from shopping at retailers like Costco as a national security measure. And this comes in the context, Professor Marandi, of big conversations happening. Maybe you can help us understand, because while the Trump administration is putting Iran kind of in the back seat area, given everything that Ramzy just said, all the challenges that it faces, there still is this question of snapback sanctions and Iran's participation in so-called nuclear inspection, where you have lawmakers pushing for a complete withdrawal from the IAEA and there's been some back and forth around that. So, talk about where Iran is regarding its position vis-a-vis the U.S. and Israel as these so-called negotiations go back and forth. I think Iran recently just said too that U.S. negotiations are the question. They're only talking to Europeans now, lightly, and there's supposed to be snapback sanctions coming soon. Your thoughts?
You know, Danny, the U.S. is fully supportive of Israel, obviously, and Trump, for whatever reason, whether it's because of Epstein or whatever, he is totally in bed with Netanyahu. But the American people aren't. And even after the death of Charlie Kirk, when we see people pointing fingers at the Israeli regime, so many people in the United States believe it. I don't know what happened to Charlie Kirk. I know that the FBI official version doesn't make much sense, but the very fact that people point fingers at the regime, or when they speak about 9/11, they no longer believe the official story and they start pointing fingers at the Israeli regime or JFK and so on, shows how despised the regime is, how widely despised it is. Now you can shut down TikTok, you can shut down everything else, but people have woken up. People are seeing the reality. A Holocaust is not something that you can really hide that easily. So today, the world that we live in is very different from the world that we lived in 2 years ago. Just these 2 years have made things fundamentally different. And the regime, by the way, has been shown to be detrimental to U.S. interests. It is dragging down the entire West with it because the world sees this as a Holocaust being carried out by the collective West. People, young people in the West, people across the world, they're looking in horror. In future, the United States cannot talk about human rights or human values or freedom, because increasingly we see people being oppressed in the United States, people being jailed, people being deported, people being taken to court, uh, people losing their platforms simply for defending Palestine, simply for protesting against a genocide. It's quite stunning. So the soft power of the United States, the soft power of the West, has been utterly demolished across the world. People have much more respect for non-Western countries than Western countries, despite the fact that the West has been demonizing them successfully somewhat for decades, for many decades, Iran in particular. So this is a fundamental shift. And I think, as Ramzy pointed out, the Israelis are not all-knowing. They miscalculated in this war, and they failed. It was a blitzkrieg, but they still failed. And not only does it show the power of Iran and the public legitimacy of the state, but it shows how the Israeli regime miscalculates. And it also shows uh, how much Iran knows about Israel, how much Iran knows about the regime, that Iranian missiles could strike their targets with great effect, and to get right through those many layers of defenses that have been put together by the Americans and the Europeans, and through radar bases in Turkey and across the Persian Gulf, and as they use the airspace of Jordan and Syria, they still failed. And it shows, by the way, that these missile capabilities that Iran has, which is probably among the 2, 3, 4 most advanced missile systems in the world, alongside probably the Chinese and the Russians, it shows that despite sanctions, what a country can do, and what an independent country can do, and what people in the global south can do. We no longer live in the world where the West can pretend and claim that they have all the knowledge and that we must go to them to learn how to do things, and they're always a step ahead of us. And that is one of the myths that the Israeli regime always used, always pretended that it knew more, that it had better intelligence, that it had better capabilities. but it lost in this war. And it lost in this war despite the fact that Western intelligence agencies collectively were helping them. Their embassies in Iran, their embassies in countries around Iran, and of course, sadly, regional countries neighboring Iran. The Republic of Azerbaijan, a close ally of the Israeli regime. Erdogan, an ally of Netanyahu of sorts in the Persian Gulf. Despite that, the country was able to defeat the regime. And next time round, it's going to be far worse because Iran is now prepared. They've given it their best shot, and now Iran has learned their capabilities, and they're building up their defensive and offensive capabilities. But this, I think, is a big win for the global South. This should give self-confidence to young people everywhere that we can do things, that they can do things in their own countries, whether it's in South Africa or Southern Latin America, or whether it's in Central Asia or South Asia or West Asia or East Asia. These young people, they can do wonders, and no one can stop them as long as that they have that determination. The Israeli regime is really the final colony of the West, the final major colony in the West that has occupied a part of the global South. But the colonization of the mind still exists. It is something that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years. Our minds have been colonized for so long, but this is gradually collapsing. Every time Ansar Allah hits back, something breaks something breaks. Some part of this colonization falls from this broader network, from this broader image. And I think that Iran's response, the resistance together, and of course, the people of Gaza, the heroic resistance in Gaza, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the other smaller groups, all of them, and the people, the women and the children who simply refuse to give up their land, who simply refuse to leave despite the genocide. They're showing the global North, the West, that they are not all powerful. The West is destroying itself. Every child that they kill, they're destroying themselves. So they're being destroyed economically. And by the way, as the West declines economically, by antagonizing everyone, literally, everyone, China, Russia, Iran, but now India and Brazil, among others, they're antagonizing everyone. So, and as the West declines, does that benefit the Israeli regime? No, because this puny regime is completely dependent on handouts from the West. Without a powerful West, they are not powerful. So as the fortunes of the West decline, so do the fortunes of the Israeli regime. So their economies are on the decline. Their military is on the decline. Their soft power is destroyed. The world is changing much faster than we think. These are very dark times. And I'm not saying that this darkness is going to go away anytime soon. But those who have imposed this darkness upon us and upon the world, they are faltering. They are growing weak. They are growing vulnerable, and it shows. And the best thing about it is that young people in these countries are waking up. Young Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, people from all walks of life, they're waking up, and they want something different. They want a sane government. They want a sane political establishment that builds America, that builds Britain, that builds France, and builds Germany, and has a decent relationship with the rest of the world. And that's what the rest of us want too. Even those people in the West who are angry about immigrants and dark-skinned people like ourselves, they are coming to the recognition that all these wars are the reason why people have immigrated there. Otherwise, people are fine where they lived. The Syrians were fine until the dirty war. The Libyans were fine until they destroyed the country. people across Latin America were fine until the Americans destroyed their economies and their governments by supporting dictatorships and cruel and brutal regimes, and so on and so forth. Afghanistan, you may not know this, Danny, but since it's a country neighboring Iran, before the revolution in Iran, Afghanistan had, in many ways, it was more developed than Iran. I have to go back to the numbers, but the percentage of people who went to school, or our region was very bad. Iran was very bad under the Shah, despite all the oil that was exported. But the situation, Afghanistan and Iraq were both countries that were doing okay compared to other countries in the region. It was the United States that destroyed Afghanistan. It wasn't even the Soviet Union so much. I mean, I'm not saying the invasion of Afghanistan was an unacceptable crime, but the United States encouraged them to invade. We now know that Carter and his national security advisor, they plotted in Afghanistan to support these so-called mujahideen in order to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So they destroyed Afghanistan. So these millions of Afghans who've gone to Europe, they didn't go because they just didn't like their towns and villages and they wanted to live somewhere else. They went because they were all destroyed. The same is true in Iraq. The same is true elsewhere. So people in the West are waking up to the reality that the Western political establishment has brought this upon its own people, and they are continuing to brutalize people across the world. I, therefore, am optimistic about the future. I'm not pessimistic, but that doesn't mean that things are going to change overnight. They may even get worse. But ultimately, I think the fact that people are waking up is the most important thing of all. What we want is a world where people understand what's going on. We don't want to live in a world where people are lulled by Western media and by the rich and the powerful who create these narratives, and people believe those narratives, and as a result, they close their eyes to death and destruction and genocide and the Holocaust.